There's four basic ingredients in beer, and barley malt is one of them. Brett, where does Urban Artifact get their malt?
Well, Mike, that's a great question because I thought you were going to ask me what the other three ingredients in beer were, and I was prepared to say flesh, blood, and bone.
That one comes out in October.
But when I'm buying my malt, I buy from Malt Europe because they make the best quality malt at the best possible price. Some of the best breweries in the world use Malt Europe, and I am proud to say that Urban Artifact is one of those breweries.
Do you have to be a commercial brewery to use Malt Europe malt?
You don't. You can head down to your local homebrew store and you can find a wide selection of Malt Europe malts there. So if you're a pro brewer or a home brewer alike, get the best value, the best product at the best price. Get Malt Europe.
And they support us. So Prost.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to another episode of the Brew Skies Happy Hour podcast. My name is Brett Coleman Baker, brewer and owner at Urban Artifact Brewery in Cincinnati, Ohio, and I am here, like always, with my good pal and confidant, Michael Morgan. Mike, how the hell are you?
Let me be brutally honest with you, Brett. That's the sound of me getting a lot better.
Well, we all have those days, that's for damn sure. Well, this is a special episode because this is the first episode of season 1.5. At least that's what we're calling it. And this is going to be a little bit different than the prior seasons. This is going to be a little bit more narrative. What we're going to do is explore a little bit more on why craft beer was necessary. Yes, we started in the 1970s with the birth of craft beer, but how did we get to that point?
Yeah, we start out with this assumption, this truism, that beer in the 1970s sucked. And we stand by that. But we haven't really answered why beer sucked. So, what we're going to do in this season 1.5 is go back in time, back way before the start of craft beer, because what we have come to realize is to explain why beer sucked so bad in the 1970s, you really have to go back to the 1870s. So, we're going to go back to around about before that even. Let's head back all the way to the 1700s, kind of start at the beginning of the country, and talk a little bit about what we were drinking and how we came from the beers that founded America to everything being, Budweiser and Miller by the time we're into the 1970s.
And to help illuminate what things were like back then, we got in touch with our good friend Brian Alberts.
Brian, for those of you who don't know, is a beer historian. He has a PhD from Purdue University, which neither you or I happen to have, Brett.
Even though we did go to school for about 10 years each.
Absolutely, but I specialized predominantly in the bar scene on Court Street, which I think was perhaps your minor.
Yes.
He also is a freelance writer, and he's contributed to some publications that you guys have heard of, including The Atlantic and The Washington Post. Brian specializes in the history of beer and what it means in broader American culture. He has his own podcast, which is really good, called Brewed Culture, and he's also a contributor to Good Beer Hunting. So he's a guy that knows a lot about American beer history. We're fortunate to have him as a resource. He's also just a lot of fun to drink some beers with. So he's the guy for the day.
For the most part, the U.S. didn't have much of a brewing industry prior to 1840 or so. The exceptions to that are specific cities in northeastern states like New York City, Philadelphia, or Albany. But I mean, in 1830 or so, Americans were drinking a ton of alcohol, about 3 times as much alcohol in absolute terms as they do today. But they were drinking 4 gallons of alcohol's worth of whiskey like a year, and then another 2 in cider on average. But they were drinking zero point 0.1 gallons of beer at that same time. So just beer was not that much of a factor unless you lived in one of these areas where you might skew that average locally. But when the brewing industry was so small that a lot of people were making their own stuff at home, and they would just be putting, anything they could find outside on the ground that seemed edible, into the beer from, gourds and pumpkins to tree bark and everything.
Beer in the 1700s was, what do we have available to us? What's growing around us? What can we use to possibly get sugars and ferment something that is a spitting distance to beer? It wasn't pretty. It wasn't nice. It's not industrialized. That's it. And it wasn't that great.
If it ferments and whatever, toss it in. If you remember in episode 10 of season 1, we talked to Bill Owens, the guy that started America's first brew pub. And Bill told us that George Washington had a recipe for beer that had pumpkin in it.
Yes.
And, I've talked to a few people. Some of those recipes, like Jefferson's recipes and Washington's recipes, some of them are still around, and people have made them. And I have heard 100% of the time that they always suck. They're not good beers. You can get all patriotic about it and shit, and I'd like to try one for just the historic understanding. But, it was pretty... It was like a lot of home brewing gone wrong for the most part.
There's a reason we're not drinking pumpkin corn molasses beers to this day.
Right. Somebody will make one, but it's a bad idea.
Yeah, don't. Let's learn from the past and let's just leave it lie.
So 1700s, it's some small breweries, but mostly if you're drinking beer, you're brewing it in the farm. The early 1800s, we are still a country that is very defined by immigration from England. And our beers look like it. So when we get into very early industrialized brewing in the early 1800s, we're drinking predominantly English ales and porters. So then we start to see the first waves of German immigration in about the 1840s.
And with them came lager yeast, which defines American beer culture for the next 150 years. But more importantly, they brought their German beer manufacturing practices and their beer brewing culture. If I remember correctly, Brian had something to say about that.
While this was all going on, Americans are drinking very, very little beer. And when that really changes and the industry really gains steam and becomes a force to be reckoned with in the country is when Germans bring lager beer to the United States, which starts around 1840. But it doesn't really pick up momentum until the 1850s in terms of like production numbers and things like that. And then around 1860 or so, in certain cities, I can't say this is nationwide, but in certain cities, a good rule of thumb is about 1/3 of beer being produced would have been lager beer.
And around the same time, we're seeing industrialization take hold, which brings with it a whole slew of advancements that allow for beer to move from the corner keg into the glass bottle at your house.
All of these things are moving and working together. Germans are the single largest immigrant group throughout the 19th century. And that changes our beer. Our beer transitions from being predominantly or entirely English, Scottish, Irish styles to being predominated by German styles. Lagers and pilsners, to the extent that you can make them right here, they become the thing. And we actually begin that transition into a country that drinks German-style yellowish lagers. That really kind of starts about the 1840s.
And it only accelerates. And it only continues to accelerate through the 1970s. But the beginning was the 1840s. And then we have what ultimately changed the fabric of beer drinking in America in 1861 with the passing of the excise tax laws. Prior to that, making alcohol was free in this country. It didn't cost you a cent to the federal government. After 1861, it now costs pennies per gallon paid as a tax.
It was the first real regulated industry in the country. And it became regulated from that tax standpoint in 1861 to pay for the Civil War.
This forced economies of scale. This forced beer to move from something alewives did or something that your wife did at the house or something that your buddy down the road did and he sold on the weekends in his backyard pub. It now became a manufacturing powerhouse. And we're talking, at least in the 1860s, going from 1865 at 2,200 breweries making 1,600 barrels a year on average, to literally 30 years later, 1,700 breweries that are making on average 19,000 barrels of beer a year So we're talking just an explosion over 30 years of industrial manufactured beer.
From the years 1877 to 1895, Anheuser-Busch grew by over 1,000%. Schlitz, which became the number 2 beer in the country and stayed that way for a long time, grew over 700%. Pabst also grew about 700%. And all those breweries had one thing in common.
These early breweries that were actually making the industry something of consequence in the United States, those were very heavily German, and therefore the culture that they were creating was very heavily based on German ethnicity and traditions brought over from southern Germany. I think what's happening now very much draws on kind of the seeds planted by that German beer culture. The number of brew pubs I walk into that have any outdoor seating, and I look at it and I just see like German beer garden influences, right? I would say basically any brewery that you walk into that has a lot of long tables and bench seating, is drawing in some small way from like the German drinking culture that was brought into the United States 170 years ago or whatever.
With all this cultural change that is happening in America, looming in the distance, you have an all-important steaming locomotive of change coming with industrialization as well. It's really mind-boggling to wrap your head around the rate of change that was happening for these breweries. I mean, we're talking about artificial refrigeration,
Huge.
the railroad system, pasteurization, mechanized bottle production and filling, the bottle cap, all within the span of 15 years.
Right. And you back up and think about what all of those things mean together. Pasteurization. So now for the first time, your beer has a longer, more stable shelf life.
Mm-hmm.
And they were only using it originally for bottled beer. Before mechanized bottle manufacturing and mechanized bottle filling, if you wanted to bottle a beer, somebody had to actually make that bottle by hand. And if you go into an antique store and you see, old beer bottles, you'll see they all have little bubbles in them. And that's because some poor bastard was making every single one of those bottles by hand.
Thousands of poor bastards were hand-blowing glass bottles, and they had to be consistent because you had to cap those fuckers. It was an insane undertaking prior to the mechanization of just bottles alone.
And once you get the bottle, then you have to fill the bottle by hand individually, which is definitely not a time-efficient task.
And if your beer wasn't pasteurized, there's a good chance that pressure would have kept building in these bottles. And if you have a bottle with a bubble in it, that bottle's going to blow up when it gets too much pressure in it. All these things led to basically bottling beer was a terrible idea prior to the advent of pasteurization.
One of the things that pasteurization does is pasteurization basically kills your beer.
Yes.
Yeah.
So pasteurization is heat over time. The more heat and the longer amount of time, the more pasteurization units you gain on your product. Modern day Coca-Cola has 65 PUs. That's basically 10 minutes at 185 degrees Fahrenheit. So this allows you to dial in exactly how much kill you have on yeast, bacteria, all the nastiness is in your products. It does change flavor a little bit. And if you're curious what that tastes like at home, go out and find yourself some MGD, Miller Genuine Draft, and some Miller High Life. Those are the same exact beers. MGD is not pasteurized. Miller High Life is pasteurized. Literally the same recipe. So if you want to know what pasteurization tastes like at home, have at that. But pasteurization is a crazy thing, how simple of a concept it is. Apply heat to this liquid and you kill everything inside of it. Insane that it took until 1860s for that to be developed.
And when you don't do that, if your yeast aren't done eating all the sugars in your beer, they're going to continue to change the flavor of that beer. They're going to also continue to add to the carbonation of that beer.
And you know what's crazy is that people used to die from milk. Like milk killed thousands of people. Raw milk, listeria, it kills people. Guess what? Udders are close to the shit box of a cow. They get covered in poop. You get poop in your milk. You die. With pasteurization, pasteurization, you can drink that poop milk and you're gonna be okay. So that's what always kills me is people always come talk about like raw milk being this great thing. Like no. Pasteurization saves lives. Don't be a fool. You don't realize how much it goes into everything. Anything canned, anything bottled, milk, beer, food, all of it's pasteurized. This was life-changing for every single person on earth.
So you can bottle beer more cheaply, more easily. You can do it on an industrial level. The beer itself has a long shelf life.
Yep. We're talking years now.
Years. You have a national railroad that can distribute your beer anywhere in America, basically. That's a new thing. Anheuser-Busch really latches onto the concept of the refrigerated rail car. So you can keep your beer cold, which is going to further stabilize the flavor of it. And it has a longer shelf life. You're not going to get the bacteria in it that's spoiling it. The yeast isn't going to continue to eat the sugars in it and explode the bottles or radically change the flavor. So all these things combined mean for the first time, if you have the capital, you can start selling your beer all over the country.
The rail system cannot be understated here either. We're talking about the ability to capitalize on one location like no time in the history of humanity. Where before, if you wanted to grow your brewery business, you would have to open a whole bunch of really small breweries all over your city. And if you wanted to expand to another city, anywhere you wanted to serve beer, you needed to be making it. And you needed to be making a lot of it, which means you probably had a lot of pubs and a lot of breweries. That is a shitload of money, not only in land, but in buildings, and then all the equipment to put into it. But with a railroad, you could just build one massive place and bring in all your ingredients, all of your supplies, keep building up and capitalize on one building where instead of investing in more land and more buildings, you're just investing in equipment. And now with the refrigeration, like you said, boom, you can hit every single urban population area in America with brewery fresh beer literally within a week.
That's just the refrigerated rail cars. When you look at what artificial refrigeration did inside the breweries themselves, that was no less revolutionary.
Yeah, we're talking about the ability to control fermentation temperatures now, which is a huge win. We're able to make lighter, cleaner tasting beer consistently. Yeah. And those brewers who embraced the temperature control off the bat, who embraced this science of microbiology, which was basically brand frickin' new in the 1860s, they were able to make consistent beer, which means if you had an Anheuser-Busch beer in, well, I guess it was just Budweiser then. If you had a Budweiser in New York City, and then you went to Texas and had a Budweiser, and you went to St. Louis and had a Budweiser, they're all going to taste the exact same because they embraced these scientific advancements.
You go in a relatively short period of time from beer being made in open wooden vats where bacteria, frequently even rats, and all kinds of other shit are falling into your beer.
There's rat shit, bat shit, cat shit. There's just all types of shit.
All kinds of stuff are falling into those vats. And the vats themselves are made of wood, so they're impossible to ever really clean all the bacteria and nastiness out of between batches. And you don't have consistent temperatures because you're cooling those spaces with ice. And the ice isn't going to give you, it's the parts of the beer that are lower to the ground where you have more ice are going to be at different temperatures in the exact same vessel as the rest of it. So all of that meant that your beer would have been incredibly inconsistent at best.
Yep.
Almost always sucked, probably. So in a short period of time, you go from that to metal tanks and artificial refrigeration where every bit of liquid in that tank is the same temperature. But you can only do that if you have the money to do it. Pabst is a great example. Pabst actually almost doubled their capacity. They went from something like 450,000 barrels a year to over 900,000 barrels a year in a short period of time just by switching to artificial refrigeration.
We're talking about being able to capitalize on your space better.
Yeah.
To not have to have floor space dedicated to frickin' ice. Now you can build tanks that get glycol, or I don't even know if it was glycol at the time, whatever refrigerated
ammonia,
liquid.
actually.
Which
would kill you sometimes. That was a byproduct of it. But
we never said the 1860s were safe.
Right. Definitely not. It smelled like hell, and it was dangerous. But one of the other things that happens, you look at a brewery like Pabst, which doubles its capacity by investing heavily in artificial refrigeration. But that's expensive as hell. Once they do it, though, they can make beer more cheaply.
Yes.
And it would have even been better beer.
It absolutely would have been better. The consistency's there, the ability to dial in your flavor profiles as you want, the tools to the brewer being increased as in a tool of temperature control means that more flavor levers can be pushed and pulled, which means at the end of the day, potentially more choice for you as the consumer and just a lot better tasting beer.
It's at least better tasting beer, and for a while, maybe it's more choice. But ultimately, you can see how that sets the industry up long term for giving you less choice. Because those breweries that have the capital can expand almost exponentially. Saloons get bought up by breweries. They have direct control at a retail level. It's called the Tide House system. It's illegal today, and we'll explain why and talk about that in a future episode. But in the 19th century, a big brewery like Pabst or Anheuser-Busch or Schlitz, they owned hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of saloons. And as they start to expand across the country, for the first time, breweries are encroaching on each other. St. Louis breweries have saloons in Milwaukee and vice versa.
And they did not carry each other's stuff.
Right.
As Brian mentioned,
this was a period of capitalism run amok. And so a lot of these breweries obtain their tide houses, not always by building them from the ground up, because that was expensive. So what you do is you send your rep in to an existing independent saloon, and you say, hey, I know times are tough. I know, you don't have a lot of spare money floating around. What if I covered your liquor license for next year? And hey, I know it's a little bare on the walls. What if I gave you some brewery, memorabilia or whatever to put on the walls? What if I paid for some of your glasses? Oh, and by the way, could you sign this piece of paper saying that you'll always have my beer on draft? And so next thing you know, they don't really have control of their property anymore. They don't really have control of their business anymore, and they either need to close up shop, in which case the brewery would just immediately, reopen with a new proprietor at the same location, and and the original one would have to go somewhere else, or you just accept your new life as an employee of the Pabst Brewing Corporation or whatever.
One of the reasons the Tide House system was made illegal is that it contributes to monopolies. And what we see in the late 1800s is monopolies in the Gilded Age really running amok. And a handful of people own everything, and the number of breweries is getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and fewer people are controlling more and more businesses. It's not until we get into post-World War II that we see the real explosion in America of small business owners. And it has everything to do with anti-monopoly legislation being enforced. And we're again in a period of time where anti-monopoly legislation is not being enforced. So we have fewer and fewer companies that own everything. So becoming that small business owner who now wakes up one day and realizes that capitalism means I work for Pabst, it's not very different from being that small business owner today that wakes up and realizes, holy shit, I'm grossly underpaid as a vendor for Amazon. So through a lot of America at this period of time, the late 1800s, early 1900s, you have a lot of local breweries that still have local names, but they're actually owned and controlled by one company. There were a town like, I think, Dayton, Ohio, every single brewery in that town was owned by one of a couple different trusts. I think, Toledo, Ohio is the same way. So all these
Iron City and
mid-sized cities,
Pittsburgh.
yes.
There was 12 breweries just in Allegheny County that were all part of Iron City. If you want to hear them, because it's ridiculous, it's Pittsburgh Brewing Company, Wainwright Brewing Company, Phoenix Brewing Company, Keystone, Winter Brothers, Philip Lohr, John Inhauser, Eberhard and Ober, Hippoly and Sons, Ober Brewing Company, Saithforth Brewing Company, Straw Brewing Company, and Iron City Brewing Company were all just in Iron City Brewing as a trust.
Yeah, so they all sound like small individual breweries.
But they weren't.
They were not. But how do we make the leap from beer gets better as a result of technology to beer sucks?
Yeah, that's a great question, because if the ability to make better beer more consistently is there, you would think consumers would want to drink a wide variety of products.
Yeah, great news. Technology has given us better beer.
More selection and choice than ever.
Yeah.
Was not the case. I have a theory that people just don't really like beer. I've always trended towards lighter, more watery, lower ABV-ish beer throughout human history. When we got the ability to stop using wood fire to make malt and make our beer so our beer wasn't smoky anymore, we jumped right on it. When we got the ability to move from coal to coke to cook and heat our malt so we could do it for less time to make a lighter colored malt, we went to it. And now everything's light colored malt. When we got the ability to start using adjuncts to lighten the flavor of beer, we jumped right on it. And this is a big sticking point in modern craft dialogue of like, oh, adjuncts are shitty and cheaper. They weren't cheaper. They weren't then and they aren't now. They just have a lighter taste than malt. So they were preferred and they were actually a selling point for people. So we have this consumer that, as far as I can tell, actually doesn't want a flavorful beer.
And I don't disagree with you, but I think it's actually broader than that. I mean, it's your theory that people don't like beer. I think that I have a slightly different theory, which is that a majority of people don't like flavor. And because you look at it throughout most of the foods that we eat.
Boiled chicken?
Boiled chicken. I mean, any mass-made product that is labeled extra sharp cheddar cheese is not extra sharp cheddar cheese. It tastes like absolutely nothing. Most people, at least most Americans in particular, like bland stuff. And it sells, man. Mm-hmm. It sells. It sells, and it's also not a new thing, I think, is what we're learning. That if we go back as far as the 1800s, when we could make better beer, we did. And so it did improve from what was there before. But it also, at that same time, starts its march towards being less flavorful. But it gets assisted again along the way for a few different reasons.
There was a purity associated with less flavor as well.
Brian, can you enlighten us on that?
It was the pursuit of perfection. People at that time were more likely to believe that there was a scientifically perfect beer that perfectly dovetailed science and industrialization, and like this was a beer to be appreciated and revered and drunk. And they had kind of coalesced around thinking that like Pilsner was that type of beer. So like why are you making this clunky porter or any type of beer? Because that's an imperfect beer, not just because of taste and whether it like has off flavors, but because it's not made the way beer's supposed to be made. It's a product of dark age techniques that we are supposed to be moving away from as we grow ourselves into a perfect society.
As soon as manufacturing came around and you could have consistency and clean, less flavored products that the manufacturing world said were healthier and better for you than anything else you could get, that stuck for 100 years. It wasn't until the 1960s that people finally started rebelling against blandness in America and realized maybe white bread isn't healthier for me. But that's a different story for another episode.
And it does start out for very legitimate reasons. 19th century? No, not safe at all.
No, you couldn't drink milk without the chance of dying.
Right. There's also a lot of other things, simple things that you couldn't do without the fear of dying. I mean, there were no regulations of almost any industries. So the limitations on the different ways that manufacturers could poison you or otherwise kill you, it was really only up to the marketplace to keep people from giving you products that would make you really sick.
And on a similar note, where you have corporations running amok and there's no oversight and it's profit above people, we were seeing the rise of the Anti-Saloon League, which was largely driven by the fact that whiskey drinking in America was out of control. You had men that would stop at the saloon every day after work on their way home and get absolutely wasted on whiskey and come home and beat their wives.
Abusing their families or spending all of the money that you need for basic household goods. The approach to the Anti-Saloon League and the idea of prohibition was not the right idea, but the heart was in the right place, and it was the same concept that we need to regulate large corporations because just profiteering and greed without any sort of morality baked into the system, it goes awry.
There was some major, major problems with America's relationship to alcohol in the 1860s.
We were drunk.
Big time. In the worst possible ways.
1800s America, we were, as a culture, just shit-faced.
And the only thing that seemed reasonable that they could achieve and that they could do was create the Anti-Saloon League as a way to protect themselves. And this set beer up as the temperance drink of choice.
During that period, and I'm talking, for decades, people really were trying to figure out what the hell just lagers were and what this beer was. There were endless debates in newspapers and literal court cases that got to state supreme courts where they're debating whether the beer even gets you drunk. This is lager beer, and we compare it to whiskey, and we compare it to these 8% English style ales and porters that we're seeing more and more, or that we're seeing kind of try to compete with them on the market. But lager at the time is 3 or 4%, and you have the German immigrant saloon owner who sells in defiance of the law on Sunday when there's a Sunday ban or whatever the law is. And when he gets hauled into court, he says, well, the law doesn't apply to me because this beer isn't intoxicating. It doesn't get people drunk, so it's not really booze. You can't fine me for this. And this just gets dragged into court over and over, and people don't know what to do with it. They leave it up to juries. Do you think this beer gets you drunk? And they some of these juries literally get samples of beer brought into them so they can stare at it, like some Greek statue. People were trying so hard to figure out those types of very fundamental questions that the lightness of grain bills was probably not quite high up on their priority list when trying to differentiate beers from one another.
So beer voluntarily starts to push itself as a quote-unquote temperance drink, meaning it's hard to get drunk on beer. And that sounds like a joke, but when you look at the fact that ABVs in beer from the late 1800s to the early 1900s, you see typical ABV in beer go from somewhere around about 6 or 7%, which is very common among craft beers today, to below 5%, to below 4%. And the norm starts to be, 3 or 4% for a beer. And man, I don't know how many, in all honesty, I don't know how many 3% beers I would have to drink to get a good buzz on the head. But I think I would get too bloated to keep drinking before that happened.
Well, I think that's some good content for us to explore later is, will 3.2 beers get Mike drunk?
Right.
But
scientific study to come. So the Anti-Saloon League, they put pressure on the legal system that is focused around the abuses of alcohol. Now, as an important aside to that, whiskey and what's going on in bars is a major focus. But who is responsible for the fact that America has way too many bars? Largely the brewing industry because of that tied house system. So breweries have given us all of these bars in America. At the same time, they're trying to improve their reputation and distance themselves from saloons and all of the problems that come out of this bad relationship with alcohol by calling themselves a temperance drink. They're doing that voluntarily. Then we get the next radical changes in beer that are driven by a combination of how German American beer has become and America's entrance into World War I.
Basically, the rise of lager beers in the country And the rise of the modern brewing industry during the 19th century, as we always hear about and as we know about, that seeded everything that we experience even today, was very deeply tied to the progress of German ethnicity in the United States. Kind of going from these new weird outsider immigrants to being more and more accepted, and then having that get turned on its head again when World War I breaks out, and there's this massive wave of anti-German sentiment in the United States, and beer is wrapped up in that entire story all the way through.
When we get into World War I, we have a president who's really kind of inclined towards prohibition to begin with. And the Anti-Saloon League is at its peak of power. This is the first, this is the greatest, this is the mothership of special interest organizations. And World War I and the Germanness of beer creates this atmosphere where Wilson, as president, gets pressured by the Anti-Saloon League to use emergency war measures to reduce the ABV in beer to 2.75%. The rationale is that we're going to take grain away from the German brewers to give to our proud, brave American troops. And really, seriously, 3% beer, 3.2% beer, damn near like water. 2.75?
There's nothing there.
What's the fucking point? I mean, aside from the fact, it's nice actually to be able to have some beers, crush some beers, and not get all tanked.
Sure.
And
the idea worked, though. It does reduce grain. You get your sugars from your grain. You get your alcohol from your sugars. So by limiting the ABV to 2.75%, you limit the amount of grain that the brewers can use, which means you have more grain devoted to the war effort. And it worked as intended, but it really negatively impacted America's taste for beer.
It would have reduced use of grains, but the amount of grain that was being used by the brewing industry was pretty nominal, number one. Number two, how much barley do you eat?
Outside of beer? None.
Yeah. So, yes, less grain was used, but it really had to do, I think, more with the ulterior motives of the Anti-Saloon League and the fact that Woodrow Wilson was pretty receptive to the idea of reducing alcohol use and consumption. I mean, Wilson was a really uptight prick. And, he was a guy that the brewing industry wasn't a big fan of because they kind of feared, his tendencies. And he definitely played into that in 1918. We get into the war in 1917 and we get this 2.75 ABV thing. 1918.
A year later, almost to the day.
A year later, he says you got to stop using all grain in beer.
Anything that you don't have on hand.
Yes.
Which is entirely horseshit because you know how much grain you keep on hand if you're a small brewer? Basically none.
Right. But if you're Anheuser-Busch or Pabst or Schlitz.
And you probably knew this law was coming and you had a chance to load up ahead of time, buy some extra silos or do whatever you had to do and fill them up. Boom. Now you're set because you didn't have to get rid of that grain that you had. You could keep using it, but you needed a lot if you wanted to stay in business for any amount of time.
So in a 2-year period of time, thank you, Uncle Sam, beer just got way worse, and the big breweries that already had the capital advantages got additional capital advantages. So the big guys get bigger, the beer gets worse, and then 1919, the 18th Amendment gets passed.
And for those of you that don't know, the 18th Amendment outlawed alcohol.
Yeah, that's the Prohibition Amendment. Ultimately, it's the combination of the Germanness of American beer and World War I that gave us Prohibition. The Anti-Saloon League had been focusing mostly on all of the evils that came out of overindulgence. The domestic violence, the damage to families, the criminality. And this was predominantly linked to extreme drunkenness and to hard liquor. So the brewing industry had really pushed itself as a temperance alternative. Beers got lighter and lighter, as we've discussed. So by the time we head into Prohibition, beer is really the low alcohol alternative to drinking hard liquor. It should be set up to be the alternative to getting really wasted on whiskey. Then World War I starts, or more to the point, it starts in 1914. We get involved in 1917. And when America enters the war, America's single largest immigration group becomes suspect, the Germans. And what is beer? Beer is ethnically German. So beer, almost overnight, becomes anti-American. And all of the rational, maybe well-founded arguments of the Anti-Saloon League about the evils of alcohol and the violence and the crime that's associated with it, all of that really gets supplanted by patriotism. Beer is German. Germany is bad. Alcohol, therefore, is evil. And that's really the argument that pushes Prohibition over the finish line. So when the 18th Amendment gets passed, it makes it possible to criminalize the manufacture of intoxicating liquors. That was the language in the 18th Amendment. But then there has to be legislation that defines that. It's an interesting historic question. It's one I think we talked to Maureen Ogle about a little bit, and that's season 1, episode 7, by the way. Go back and listen to it. If Congress had decided to define intoxicating liquors in the Volstead Act as being, let's say, 3% or even 2.75%, the brewing industry could have continued. People would have drank 2.75% beer because they'd already grown accustomed to 2.75% beer as being what beer was. And it's not going to get you really hammered unless you work at it very hard, but it's going to give you a little bit of a buzz. It's going to make you feel kind of good. So there is an alternative history where we would have eliminated hard liquor and we would have replaced it with very moderate beer. And maybe what would have happened as a result of that is that we would have become a country that just drank alcohol in a more temperate, reasonable way. Instead, Congress did what it does so often, what it has absolutely done in the entire history of the drug war, which is to overreach and decide that just say no was the answer. So by failing to be reasonable, we really kind of forced the hand of a criminal enterprise. We created gangsters and we created bad bathtub gin by refusing to define intoxicating liquors at a reasonable percentage. I mean, at the end of the day, do I want to live in a country where we all learn to love 3.2% beer and that's what we still drink today? Not really, but it may have given us a much healthier interaction with alcohol.
I'll take the challenge of trying to get drunk on 3% alcohol beer, but I know for a fact we will never get drunk on 0.5% alcohol beer.
No, absolutely not. And it's not going to be pleasant to even try it because although there's been some technological advances with near beer in the past few years, the traditional way to make a near beer was to make a real beer and then boil the hell out of it.
Just cook the living shit out of the beer.
Yeah. Every bit of flavor out of it, wreck it, destroy it, make it disgusting, and here's your near beer. It tastes like shit and it won't get you drunk. How many do you want? And as it turns out, Americans didn't want that many.
We always want something to fuck us up. There's gotta be something in our lives that's readily accessible, that's socially allowed, that just is absolutely gonna wreak havoc on our society to some degree or another. And what we did then is realize that, like, oh, this not really sweet, not alcoholic, bullshit grain cooked beverage sucks, but mass sugar has become readily available. Soda shops and soda fountains and the advent of just dumping a lot of flavor and sugar into a product and selling that was ripe for takeoff. And boom, we have soda sales coming in and eclipsing beer. Near beer did blow up, and I don't want to get too distracted here, but I just wanted to make this side note that Americans and people in general, we need vices. We're drawn to them, and we just substituted dumbly alcohol for sugar.
If you're giving me, and I don't like sodas, I don't drink sodas, I don't drink those things that are heavily, sugared beverages. But if my choice is a bad near beer or a Coke, I'm drinking the Coke.
Yes, every day.
And that's what Americans did.
Mm-hmm.
You see near beer sales in the U.S. People try it when it's the only game in town right out of the gate in 1920. American breweries sold 9.2 million barrels of near beer.
Which is not an insignificant amount.
No, it's a lot less than they were selling a beer, but it's still a lot.
Mm-hmm.
But by 1932, that was down to 2.7.
The end of Prohibition. By the end of Prohibition, the taste for near beer was gone. No one wanted that crap anymore.
The other important thing to remember about Prohibition is that American palates start changing. People aren't drinking as much beer by a long shot. And there's a sad, fascinating little story that I found when trying to bone up for this podcast from 1932-33, right as Prohibition's ending, and you're allowed to produce beer again. And there's this brewery in Pittsburgh that was unnamed in the source I was looking at, where the head brewer got interviewed, and he was so excited. And they had dug out their old recipe, and they were making the beer exactly as before. And they were so proud of it. But then they put it on the market, and it wasn't selling, or at least it wasn't selling fast enough, which is baffling because beer was illegal last year. Aren't people so desperate for a beer that they take any beer? You'd think, but that in this guy's interview, he's saying that that's not happening, and they couldn't figure it out. And then they realized that the consumer was finding their beer too hoppy, too flavorful, even though it was the exact same beer they'd made before Prohibition. And when they reduced the grain bill and when they reduced the amount of hops in the beer, it started selling like hotcakes again.
An interesting thing with the rise of sugar is how this coincides also with the rise of cocktails. Cocktails don't exist if it wasn't for sugar.
And they're born for two primary reasons. One is that the liquor usually sucked. Unless you were getting it out of illegal operations here in this region, Kentucky, Southwest Indiana, that was run by a gangster named George Remus, you could get good bonded whiskey that way.
Or your medicinal license.
Or through your medicinal license. You could smuggle it in from Canada.
Mm-hmm.
But otherwise, it was bathtub gin. It was bad white hooch. So you had to mix it with things to make it taste good. So the other reason is women. The 1920s is really the first sexual revolution. So women, aside from sex workers, generally didn't hang out in saloons. That is radically different from what's going on with the speakeasy scene in the 1920s. So not only do you have to make cocktails taste better because the liquor is nasty, but you have a new set of people. Young women are going to bars and ordering drinks for the first time.
That's a great point about women going to speakeasies. And I'll tell you what, if I was a dude in my 20s, in the 1920s, and all the cool chicks were going to the speakeasies, you know where I would be?
Speakeasy.
At speakeasies.
And you're drinking what they drink.
Yes.
And
especially if you're getting into liquor for the first time, and the first experience you have is with illicit liquor at a maybe shady speakeasy. Yeah, You're going to want some intense flavors in that cocktail and a high amount of sugar to make that stuff palatable.
Definitely throw a bunch of fruit juice in that, pal. Couple of those maraschino cherries. And here's a great opportunity for the resurgence of home brewing. We know how to do it. It's not rocket science. So let's just find a way to get the ingredients to make it. And there was even an industry that kind of grew up around facilitating making homebrew. So it sounds like we should have continued to have an appreciation for beer through the popularity of homebrewing in Prohibition.
Homebrewing, in large part, helped drive the resurgence and birth of craft beer, but it didn't help save beer in Prohibition America.
Actually helped make it worse. And that's because the industries that grew up around it, a lot of the major breweries, and even just some new companies, they started to make this malt syrup. And the malt syrup was marketed legally as something that you made a refreshing, healthy drink with. It would help give you, additional calories, and it would beef you up. Good for your workouts, I'm sure, whatever. In reality, these cans of malt syrup gave you warnings that were, don't mix this with yeast and some water, because that would be illegal, right? So it's essentially homebrew in a can, but the malt syrup has hops in it, which would have been like hop syrup. All of this sounds sweet and nasty. You're not going to get good hop flavors out of it. You're not going to get any kind of bitterness out of it. And what are you going to mix it with? Probably a bread yeast. Mm-hmm. Some dry, bad, inappropriate bread yeast.
All the gains in the 1860s that we had around industrialized beer production are instantly lost.
Right.
Good yeasts, temperature control, cleanliness, being able to bottle and package and pasteurize, all of that gone.
What we saw in this episode is that technology actually allowed us to make better beer. And it could have given us really the first wave of what American craft beer looks like. But that's not what happened. And it's not what happened for a multitude of reasons. Part of them were governmental, Prohibition, World War I, but part of them, as we'll talk about in the next episode, and probably multiple episodes throughout Brew Sky's infinitum, is also the choice of the consumer.
Well said, Mike. And on that note, if you also appreciated this podcast, the best way you can support this free to you endeavor is by subscribing, sharing, rating, giving it 5 stars. I don't really know. I've kind of deleted all my social media except for my podcast stuff, so I don't know how any of it works anymore as a 35-year-old millennial male. But I do know it's important, and I do know you know best. So I'm going to trust you. Just do us right. Give us some good reviews or whatever the hell it is. Tell your friends. Tell your fam. We love you. We can't wait to keep making more content. And that's all I got to say about that. So until next week, drink some good beers. Cheers.
Cheers.
The Brew Skies Happy Hour podcast is a production of Brew Skies Limited in association with 779, a leading video production and content creation agency. With over a decade of experience, 779 works with a wide range of clients, from global brands to boutique startups to mom-and-pop shops. Visit 779video.com for more information. That's the numbers 779video.com. This episode was edited by Dan Fennessy, who is also our executive producer. This podcast was engineered by Adam Rabinowitz. Thanks for listening.